violence doesn't just start one day. Usually it's a progression over time. And so when we talk about warning signs, it's not as though we knew someone in a certain state and then all of a sudden they come in one day and things are different. When someone only talks about how great their partner is, that they have no faults or flaws, that might be indicative of them being defensive, that they have something to hide.
When we hear the term intimate partner violence or IPV, we often just assume that has to be physical abuse, but it goes so much more from physical abuse, as you just alluded to. Could we walk through some of the warning signs of the different types of IPV that could be present in patients?
So one thing that's important to consider is that violence doesn't just start one day. Usually it's a progression over time. And so when we talk about warning signs, it's not as though we knew someone in a certain state and then all of a sudden they come in one day and things are different.
That's so important.
Yeah.
We just, sorry to interrupt, but we just filmed a series on trauma, and that is so different than this, because trauma can happen in an instant. It's a car accident, that's a traumatic event,
Right.
Something about it. This is a slow burn.
Usually.
Okay.
And there might be some sort of traumatic event within the intimate partner violence that can cause that kind of trauma. But usually what we see is, that disrespect, the insults starting first, or it could have been that there was physical violence, but it's been normalized. And so when we think about warning signs, it might be someone who isolates a little bit more, is less forthcoming about the quality of their relationship with their partner, or even about how things are going for their children at home, because there are feels about what child protection might do. People who aren't necessarily super forthcoming in how they spend their time, who their social network is. But what we might start to see as well is people coming in more or less frequently than what they used to. And so as violent...
Do you mean coming in to see a therapist?
Absolutely, or a family doctor even, right? And so we might be used to seeing someone, weekly or monthly or bi-monthly even, and all of a sudden they start to miss appointments. That might be a warning sign that something is different, that violence has escalated. When their communication pattern is different, when they're starting to talk about their partner in a different way, either better or potentially worse. That might also be indicative that something is different and maybe wrong.
If you like psychology and learning about mental health and want to learn more while meeting other people who are interested, explore your membership options using the link below this video or visit MedCircle.com.
When you say talk about their partner in a different way, better or worse, I do that all the time. Sometimes I talk about them better, sometimes I talk about them worse. So is there any more specifics on that point that could better indicate that this person may be, dealing with intimate partner violence?
Absolutely. So like most relationships, there are good days and bad days, right? And so we will talk about our partners in all sorts of wonderful and less wonderful ways.
Yep.
And that is very normal. When someone only talks about how great their partner is, that they have no faults or flaws, that might be indicative of them being defensive, that they have something to hide.
Yes.
Or if all they're talking about is how awful their partner is all the time, that might also be indicative that there's something wrong. A relationship should never just be awful all of the time.
Yeah, good point. Good point. For a doctor or a nurse who's seen patients, maybe not over a course of 6 months or a year, they might just have them for a day or a few days. Are there any signs they can look out for that could indicate there's something going on at home that needs to be addressed?
Yeah, so if a partner demands to be in the room, that might be a warning sign, and that happens sometimes, right? So a husband or a boyfriend will insist on being there, on sometimes answering questions for the survivor. That might indicate that there's something going on. Now we need to remember that there are also cultural norms around how people interact with professionals or with other people. And so just because that's happening does not necessitate violence,
of course,
but it's something to pay attention to.
That's really important. If the first responder or the frontline worker notices that this, we'll just say in this example, the husband is continually saying, well, I need to be there for that, or let me answer that question. would it be beneficial for them to say, hey, I need to speak to the patient alone for a few minutes. Can you give us some space?
Yep, that would definitely be a possibility.
Okay.
It's important for first responders to not insert themselves into situations, right? And so when we do that, what we might actually do is end up escalating the situation. So in that moment, we might see the woman on her own and we might be able to get some information or not. But what we don't know is what happens as soon as they leave. Mm-hmm. And so if there is any kind of discomfort around that, it's better to keep the situation contained than for there to be a risk of the husband believing that the wife disclosed any kind of violence or tension in the relationship. Mm-hmm. Research tells us that as soon as a disclosure is made or an attempt to leave is made, the likelihood of more severe violence is amplified. And so we don't want to be the reason for more harm to be done.
Yeah, really important that people understand that. What mental health symptoms might health workers and first responders see in individuals that indicate ongoing issues of IPV?
Mm-hmm. So you might see more frequent articulations of self-blame and low self-worth. So everything is my fault. I'm no good. I can't do anything. I can't even make my husband happy. I can't take care of my children properly. So that might be, and we can maybe call that a mental health symptom, but a lot of us experience that, and we might see it a little bit more with survivors of intimate partner violence. We might also start to see more frequent things like panic attacks. We might start to see some levels of anxiety escalating. A door slamming might instigate a startle response. Someone might be more watchful of their environment or people walking by, and those things could also indicate intimate partner violence.
Are there physical symptoms to look for? I know that seems obvious, but are there?
Yeah, so things like frequent bruises or cuts. If someone says that they slammed their head or they fell, that could be indicative. Someone fainting or losing consciousness is something to look into as well. A lot of time people don't think about the cognitive effects of choking and losing oxygen to the brain, right? And that's something to definitely pay attention to. Broken bones, also very important to pay attention to. And things that frontline responders, so nurses and physicians, don't often check into. I had a friend who was a nurse, and she worked in the domestic violence unit at the hospital that she worked at. And she was explaining to me that she fell and she hurt her eye. And so she had a black eye for a bit. And no one asked her once about how it happened or whether her relationship was okay. Anything around screening for domestic violence did not happen because people just assumed she's someone who is a professional. Domestic violence or intimate partner violence wouldn't happen to her. And so it's important to remember that it can happen to anyone, and it happens to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. And there are people watching this who will say, then why did she not just leave? Mm-hmm. That is the number one. Why do they stay? And perhaps we'll address this in more detail in another session, but what is the answer to that question?
People are allowed to make the decisions that they make. Mm-hmm. We are very good at putting blame on other people. And when we ask the question, why didn't you leave? What we're doing is saying you had the ability to and you chose not to, so you're in the situation that you're in, deal with it. Mm-hmm. And it's not an appropriate question. Mm-hmm. It's one that we all wonder about, and that's fair, but by remembering that people are doing the best that they can given the resources that they have, that's why they're not leaving. It doesn't make sense to where will they go? Where will their family go?
You don't know.
Yeah.
You don't know what they're dealing with. Yeah. There could be financial reasons. There could be children involved. She could be scared for her life. There could be so many reasons that people stay. And I admittedly used to be a person years and years and years and years ago when I was a lot younger who had that bias. Yeah. Now, that's ridiculous. Just leave. Do anything you can to leave. But like you mentioned, that is their experience, and there's no way for anyone to understand their experience. Because people look at you and they look at me and go, why doesn't Kyle do the interview this way? Or why doesn't Dr. Taslim do this? Or Taslim do that? And it's like so many, you don't know how we live.
Yeah.
You don't know how we live, you know? When I want to talk about the children and the warning signs. Are there signs that we can see from children that could indicate that their parents or their guardians are in the middle of some sort of domestic violence?
So one thing that we might see is children acting like adults, so taking on more responsibilities. When children can't necessarily trust that their parents will follow through, will have the capacity to parent them the way they need to be parented, children will take that upon themselves. So they might articulate themselves as adults. They may be making adult type decisions like scheduling their next appointment when, you know, they're 7 years old. Or talking about getting breakfast ready, or talking about, you know, getting mom or dad up so that they can go to school. Things like that, what we call parentification. These are things that we might see, and it's not because parents are doing a bad job, but because when there's intimate partner violence going on, it can often take away from the capacity to do other things in our lives. So that's one thing. The other thing is when we see children glorifying a specific parent. Again, that could be a way of protecting themselves from the violence. And so, you know, dad is all good and could never do wrong. And that might be an indication. But the other thing that might happen is it might be mom is the worst. And not because mom is actually the worst, but because when you only are interacting with mom when she is going through a lot, when she is just trying to survive, mom might not have the capacity to be the best parent. And so what we end up seeing then is mom doesn't know how to be a mom. Mom doesn't wake up for school.